You probably know the story of Dr. Palmer and have heard it so many times. All I should say is that he was convicted of the murder of John Parsons Cook by strychnine, and even that is not probably true. It may have been arsenic, but they say strychnine in the papers. He possibly killed 14 others. His father, who was a very wealthy man, and upon his death, William and his brother would receive £7,000 each, but William wanted his brother's share as well, so he bumped him off as well. And his brother-in-law and his wife and his 4 younger children of the 5, his mistress, who was a servant in the house, and their illegitimate child, that's William and his mistress. His mother-in-law he absolutely despised, and the feeling was mutual. There was Leonard Bladen, who was another guy like John Parsons Cook, who he used to go to the races with, and when they won money, as I say, as he did with Parsons Cook, to steal the money, and with Bladen he did exactly the same. He laced a drink with strychnine or arsenic, whatever it was. He also went into a pub one day, and he eyed a young lady that was sitting there, whose husband was arm wrestling on the table for drinks. And he challenged George Abley because he fancied Abley's wife. And sure enough, the strychnine was administered to the pint of bitter that he brought George Abley, and he died. Now this is the outrage in the area. So by Act of Parliament, and for the first time ever, the trial was transferred to the Old Bailey in London, and that's the statute that still stands today. After the sentence, Palmer returned to Stafford Jail, where he was force-fed before hanging. And that may not be completely true. They may have told him what was going to happen to him, because Captain Phillips, who was the governor, turned round and said, "You will go to the hangman. You will not die suicide." But George Smith came along again, and he said, "I live at Rowley Regis, and I can take my horse, and I will only charge you £5, and when I've done the deed, I'll get back on my horse and go home again." So it would be a lot cheaper than bringing William Calcraft up from Chelmsford, putting him up for a night, and his expenses and everything else. And the under-sheriff, who is the person who organised the hangings there, said, "Yes, I like that idea, it's cheaper." So that's why he got the job. At the back of the main hall, and the picture down in the bottom right there, is the grave that was dug for William Palmer. It was sprinkled with quicklime, and because Stafford is built on water, it really is, the body would have disappeared, well, at least within a month. Because quicklime would have just reacted with every organ and everything. The head on the left is the death mask of Palmer, and that has also done the rounds and is also sometimes shown at the Hay House, along with the tomb. And towards the end, William Collier, he was a poacher and he shot the landowner at Wistonese, that's near Stoke. The rope slipped and Collier fell through the trap door. He was rehung 10 minutes later, Smith being booed by the crowd. And it unnerved him, because what he did, he carefully undertook more hangings. He died in 1872, so what, 6 years later, and he possibly that he committed suicide. He may have taken his own life. William Collier was the last person to be hung on the outside of the jail because of an Act of Parliament. It prohibited public executions in 1868. This is Norton Keynes, not far away. James Hewitt, again poaching. He shot the farmer's son, William Maston. Hewitt claimed the shooting was accidental. The gun went off during a scuffle, but ballistic evidence proved otherwise, that the gun had been fired from a distance. And that was the first time that that type of ballistic evidence was used in a court case, and it led to Hewitt being hung in 1893. If you take the road from Lichfield towards Walsall and you go through Rushall, and you rise up the hill to the roundabout on the top, and you turn in towards Walsall, On the left-hand side, you've got the Arboretum, and on the right-hand side, and there's still a pub there called the Butts. The area was called the Butts. And at number 8A, it's not there now, off Warwick Street, George Loke stabbed his wife, Elizabeth, with a pocket knife 10 times. Now, he probably suffered mental problems after a train shunting accident. He lost his job because of drink, and he separated with his wife for 8 years. After pleas of insanity, mercy and an appeal, Loke was hung at Stafford by Thomas Pierpoint. So we're starting to get the Pierpoints coming into the equation. It was reported that he enjoyed a hearty breakfast before his execution. And my feeling of it, and reading some of the papers, is he probably knew absolutely nothing about what was going on, but he said that's how it is. So the end of the rope at Stafford was close. They reduced the number of hangings, only 17 between 1872 and 1914. That was the date of the last hanging at Stafford Jail. There's never been any more after. In the last one being Joshua Davis, hung for the murder of his landlady. For Staffordians, execution continued at Winston Green and at Strangeways, Manchester, and the Dana at Shrewsbury. Now, the Dana at Shrewsbury has now been taken over into the private sector, and it's not a prison. And it's well worth going around if you want to spend half a day looking around the prison, you've never been around one. That's a good place to go. But if you've got grandkids and you really want a place to go, you want to go to Nottingham Prison, because there they reenact some of the cases of these early days. And everybody sits in the courthouse, which is huge, and then at the end of it, everybody gets a vote whether he should be hung or whether he shouldn't be. So it's good fun. And the kids take the place of the judge with a wig on and the prosecution, and they've got bits of paper and they read off the bits of paper. And they always pick a small lad, 9-year-old, the one I saw, and he came up to there on the dock when they looked over it to see him. So anyway. As I say, there were 3 hangmen called Pierpoint. Henry, the eldest on the left at the bottom, he carried out 105 hangings. His brother Thomas, 294. And Henry's son, Albert, carried out over 600. And that was in the 20th century. Albert really, and I know this is terrible to say, but he made an art form out of it. He wrote a book developing the drop table, which ensured that the recipient had a swift, effective demise, and he never made an accident or a fault in hanging anybody. Stafford, the first 2 hung 5 people there between 1905 and its closure for hanging in 1914. In fact, Albert Pierpoint said, it is said to be a deterrent. I cannot agree. I do not now believe that any one of the hundreds of executions I've carried out has in any way acted as a deterrent against future murder. Capital punishment, in my view, achieved nothing but revenge. I don't know. It's really what's... Because if somebody in my family had gone through some of this, then I perhaps wouldn't agree with him. But there again, that's there. So the end of capital punishment was coming. The last 2 were worked together on a robbery in Cumbria. And the idea was to rob a van delivery driver, but I'm afraid they shot him, or one of them did. And they went to Strangeways at Manchester and Walton at Liverpool, and on the same day, at the same time, they were hung in the separate prisons. And that's their pictures. That's, Sidney Silverman came along and he proposed in the Commons in 1956, and it was passed. But then it went to the House of Lords and it was revoked. So it's another 10 years before he piloted it through with resolutions. That means that they would look back on certain acts that were happening after the passing of the Murder and Abolition Death Penalty Bill to make sure that it was exactly right. And that's what happened. resolutions in 1969, Northern Ireland 1973. But when was capital punishment finally abolished in the UK? Well, there were still statutes for treason, piracy and militaria after 1965, but they were never enacted. And it was Jack Straw in 1998 that went to the European Parliament, and the documents were finally passed in 1999. Now that document, in the UK now, is held by the Supreme Court. But it can be initiated again. And I've said this all since 2015, and it worries me where we are today. But still, that's another question. So, that was Stafford Jail and how to get there. That was a picture that we found of the jail in 1870. And if ever anybody has walked through the Sherbrooke Valley on Cannock Chase, 12 of the blocks from the gatehouse made the stepping stones over the Sherbrooke, the river that runs down through the Sherbrooke Valley. So you'll think of that when you go into Cannock Chase. And of course, these are the notables. You know the top right? Rolf Harris. He got 5 years, 9 months, and he served 3 years. He was one of those that they kept referring it back to the court, and I'm afraid it flopped. And after the second time, the judge asked the Crown Prosecution Service, will you bring in any more against Mr. Harris? And they said, no, it's not worth it for the public purse. The guy at the bottom right?
Ashley Blake.
Ashley Blake, yes, he worked for the BBC.
He did.
And he was on Inside Out and on Midlands Today programmes. And he had a pub with his cohort at New Oscott, the and there was a fight in there one night, and from the back came the baseball bats, and he got 2 years for grievous or actual bodily harm. And his cohort, ironically, lived in Booth's Farm Road in Great Bar. Comes back, goes around. In the bottom left corner, you've got Dr. Palmer, the murderer, and the picture there of George Strockner Smith at the hangman. Anybody know the guy in the middle? No? His name was Michael Collins, and he was part of the rebel brigade in Dublin that fought over independence in Ireland. And all his cohorts were brought back to England. But the feeling in London was so bad at the time for the Irish question that they didn't bring them directly into London, they stored them in Stafford Jail. And we know that because we've got a picture. Oh, dear. We're there, we are there. And there's Michael Collins there, amongst all the rebels. They got posted to like a prisoner of war camp eventually in Wales, and after it all died down and sort of gone quiet again, they were all freed. So they never stood trial, and they just hung on to them. That's it. Got any questions? Thanks for doing a bit of porridge.
There's got to be some questions after that, hasn't there?
Can I just ask about the old courtroom? You said they're refurbishing it. Are they changing it?
No.
Because I did jury service about 40 years ago.
It must have been about 5 years ago, they refurbished the courtroom and the cell, the holding cells underneath. And they actually did put that in the court. It was held in the courtroom. But no, when they refurbished it, they didn't do it up to make it look all new. They left it as it was, because it's a historical thing. And all they were doing was making sure that it was in good repair. But now, because the Shire Hall's closed and they're refurbishing the other things, I don't know what it's going to be yet. They must have some plans for it. But,
were the holding cells at the Guildhall there?
They're there today, you can see them.
If you were looking
No,
at
they're straight ahead of you. As you walk in, they're right at the far end, and they're holding cells. You can go and see them. He opens them up on a Saturday morning, I think, sometimes.
No, I've actually been, but when I walked down the side of that building, where's the records office towards that? Anyway, if I walked down the side, and that's the front, I could see, I thought, a few years ago, grids at the side, at pavement height.
Yeah.
And I wondered if those were cells. Do you know? No?
Well, they could well have been, but the one there's, I think it's 3 there now at the moment. So
I think there was about that. It's
3,
been a few years.
but I don't know. I mean, some of them are toilets and storerooms now, but I don't know if there were any more there. But
Because
I mean, they didn't really hear a lot of cases, right? I mean, if you think over that period of time, they probably administered
well,
a
I
few.
know one of mine in the 1860s, and it was, as you say, the Oxford Circuit. It was just as she had heard the case, and it was over about 3 days. So my relative wouldn't have been. Well, presumably he would have stayed in Stafford. And I was just wondering where
Stafford?
they held him.
Or in Lichfield.
No, it was Stafford.
Oh, in Stafford. Oh, no, they sometimes, no, they carried they were like remand, it was like a remand prison back in the earlier days, so they would go, it was a town jail, so they would be transported from those holding cells at Stafford were just used to sit there before you were called up to the upstairs. Sorry,
Yeah, thank you. I just, yeah.
Further questions? Chris?
My wife and I went to York last week, and we went round the York Castle Museum, and you can go in the cells there. And what they've done is to, in each of the cells, they flash up the words of the condemned people, which is quite interesting and horrifying at the same time. And we were talking about it as we were coming out. My wife said to me, and I don't know the answer, is it true that arson in Her Majesty's dockyards was an offence for which you could be hung?
Yes. There were lots of military type. I mean, even if you were civil, you know, not a military person, if you did it in a military dockyard, then the answer is yeah.
And the reason for that's not difficult to see, is it? Because it's seen as threatening the security of the country.
Yeah. Just a quick thing. I type these. We have never used that type of noose in this country. They may have used them very briefly in the very early days, but all that the hangings that you see, and the one that you saw on the picture with Timothy Spall there, they use a shackle through a ring, and the rope goes through the ring. I'm not going to put this on because it's bad luck to do so. I'm not going to do that. But basically, when they put it on, that shackle comes to the side of the head. It's not at the back, it's at the side, so that when he's hung, the neck goes that way and the breakage is very quick. They do a few sort of legends around this type. You must have an odd number of rings, right? This one's got the maximum, which is 13. That's 12 for the jury and 1 for the judge. So that's the sort of written legend around it.
So Steve.
Abacum leaves on 3 times, wasn't he?
Oh yeah. Yes, there's. I mean, there are some horrendous. Sorry for the word, but there were some real ups made in hanging people. We were not good at it. William Calcraft, he preferred the short drop. That was the one that you saw right at the end, right? And it literally, it's only about this high. And then his seconder would then come round and grab his legs at the bottom and bend his knees to make a final break. I mean, how awful does that make it? But George Smith preferred the longer drop, and in that way he was more successful in that. But you have to be, well, have to be very careful when you do these sorts of activity. And we made plenty and plenty of mistakes. Even back in the 50s, we hung a man who didn't do and Christie was one of Christie's killings. So you...
Derek Bentley.
Derek Bentley, yeah. That was a pub in Croydon.
In relation with my husband.
Is he?
Yeah.
All right. Derek Bentley and his mate, I can't give his name. That's right. They went on a robbery in Croydon, and his cohorts were supposed to have said to him, let him have it, meaning give him the gun rather than bang, give him the bullet, you know. And that's what that case was all about.
Christopher Craig was to be tried. So
that's right, so he got away with it, that's right.
What about the Gaskin murders over?
Well, you know, there's so much. I've got stuff on the Gaskin murders in there, right? In the same thing, but you've got time periods and things like that, and you cut it back down. Oh, well, Gaskin murdered his wife. She was from Bridgetown, and cut her up and put her in the near where the Tesco's is today. Top of
found the head in the gas
That's right.
I mean, clearly rich material for family historians. I mean, I know my wife's got, one of her relatives was transported to Australia, and, you know, that's sort of, it's almost like royalty now in Australia if you can trace somebody back in particular to the First Fleet. But I guess it is a challenge for us. If we can't find relatives, then maybe you start thinking of maybe they weren't with the rest of the family because they might have done something they shouldn't have done. Steve, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting.